Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to a Feather of Light podcast. My name is Brandon Tiltz, and I'm your host. Today, I'd like to dive into the topic of spiritual wellness. Firstly, just defining what spiritual wellness is from my lens. And then going a little bit more into, I would say, are some practical ways one can strengthen their spiritual wellness or develop a closer relationship to what I would define as spirit. So let's see, what is spiritual wellness? Well, I would say it's a variety of things to a variety of people. Depending on what culture you look to, spiritual wellness will look very different. But let's just speak to my individual experience firstly. So I believe I spent a lot of my life not prioritizing anything related to spiritual wellness. I was actually raised from a young age to go to church, sort of indoctrinated into a Christian faith from a young age. And around age 10, I decided I didn't want to go to church anymore. And thankfully that was an option I was given, was to no longer attend church. But from that point on, I didn't actually have any relationship to spirituality at all, at least not in the conventional sense, and kind of renounced my faith in a way and felt like the role of atheist was, the title of atheist kind of felt rebellious enough where I was like, oh, okay, I like this non-Christian role. It's kind of the opposite of it. And as I got a little bit older, probably around 17, 18, I started to take psychedelics, right? Starting with, I think mushrooms was probably my first one, and then LSD, and gradually moving into other ones such as DMT in my late 20s. Now, how is this connected to spiritual wellness? Well, I would say psychedelics, it sort of reignited my curiosity in what I would describe as a more liberating, autonomous way. It reignited this curiosity for spirituality and understanding what God really even is. And maybe just starting to develop a desire to really develop this relationship with God or spirit, but on my terms, right? Not the way the Christian faith outlined it. No, I wasn't really into, I guess, becoming indoctrinated into a faith. And when I was able to tap into this source of spirituality through psychedelics, it started to really ignite my, I'd say, passion for exploring other forms of spirituality, whether it be Vedic Hinduism or Vedism, or understanding the Tao Te Ching from some lens, just Taoism. And I believe there's a few others I looked at, kind of, explored existentialism from the lens of philosophy, from Western philosophers a little bit. But at the end of it all, I really do feel more connected to a type of connecting to nature. Forget the exact word, not monism. No, there's a certain word that encompasses this, but I also refer to it as indigenous philosophy or indigenous spirituality, the way that the indigenous people viewed life and prayed to certain energies and deities and connect to spirit through community and song and prayer through the land and using tobacco, sometimes when it's smoked, but other times just by holding it and praying with it in your hand. and really just connecting to the earth in this way, thanking the earth, really feeling deeply grateful for, the sources of fire and the sources of water and the sources of air and the sources of the earth that is Pachamama, that is the Mother Earth. So how does one define spiritual wellness? I guess it's just feeling devoted and committed to one of these vehicles, let's just call them, one of these vehicles of spirituality, whether it be religion or whether it just be something you commit yourself to that's less organized or not organized at all. And you feel like you're able to really delve into that faith and foster something deep within your heart. Maybe it's a feeling of connectedness to all of consciousness, feeling of oneness or unity. Maybe it's more about fostering gratitude for each breath, for each moment, for each interaction, for the people in your life. Maybe it's about having the capacity to feel happy with things that aren't really necessarily finite or material or outside of your control, right? Like just being, I guess, content and feel a feeling of wholeness within oneself. I feel these are characteristics of somebody who's attained a level of balance within their spiritual wellness. Now, I also would say that depending where you are on the spiritual path, you might not be at that particular expression of wholeness or balance within, I don't even want to say it's just about your spirituality, but all the things that get impacted or influenced as the result of going down the spiritual path. So like one can seem like they're in a place of chaos or disarray, and like their life is just on some level kind of boundless, and maybe they are very deeply connected to spirit, but who knows? Like, you can't just sit there and, I would say, judge somebody in terms of how connected they are to spirit based on what they're doing in their life or how they show up in their life. I mean, I think we have some universal indicators of when we deem a person to be unspiritual. And I think I listed a couple of them. Let's just say someone's very deeply disconnected from nature and they're very obsessed with money or the acquiring of resources or, egotistic pleasures. I think we use the ego as a kind of indicator of how spiritual a person is. And I don't think that always holds up. If you look to the spiritual ego being a sort of misrepresentation of true spirituality, what I consider a deeper connection to the spiritual life, or even talking about this feels like my spiritual ego comes out. It's like I'm like, so I'm over here telling you what spirituality is, and yeah, if you're doing the other thing, then you're clearly not spiritual. So it does feel silly to even really put into words some of this stuff. Like I could objectively speak to what is spiritual. I mean, I think some of these things can be spoken about for sure. Some of these things can be defined, at least sort of loosely. But some of this stuff, it almost feels like ironic to speak to using a podcast, because it's like, do any of these specifics really hold the same value or definition for each individual when they relate themselves to the world of spirituality? I mean, like, this is a pretty dramatic example, but you could say there's a priest, or not the same realm, but the other side of the spectrum, like a shaman, who hold themselves to a very high regard in terms of their ability to connect to this thing we call spirit, but based on how they show up within their life, they could actually be embodying the exact opposite of what their external representation of spirituality is. So I almost feel like, the representation, the external representation of spirit oftentimes isn't really an indicator of just how connected a person is to their inner world of spirituality, or whatever spiritual wellness might mean for that person. And really talked myself into a bit of a confused mess here, but I think if you follow this and if you've done any of your own spiritual work, you kind of understand what I mean. It's just like each person has different expressions of it. There's a lot of misrepresentations of the quote unquote spiritual role model, and those aren't necessarily depictions of what most of us could consider a universal expression of spirituality. It gets distorted. Media even distorts spirituality. Looking to other people that we sort of view as spiritual could also distort our perception of spirituality. And, what is it? I guess I'll just kind of like drop all the definitions and the subjectiveness of it. What does spirituality look like to you? Ask yourself that, and maybe there's a simple truth that bubbles to the surface. Is it your ability to pray? Is it the mere fact that you choose to pray? That you're able to make that space and dedicate yourself and devote yourself to something that is not in your conscious material existence? Is it the presence of faith, right? Just having faith. These are the things where, I feel like it almost feels silly to try and tell a person that they are disconnected from spirit, because that's where the spiritual ego comes in. And it's in a sense my ego would be further justify how connected I am to spirit based on my criteria being met and theirs isn't being met. Yeah, maybe I'm overthinking it, but I don't know. That's where my intuition goes. Did I jump into a spiritual ego trap just doing this podcast? Oh. Nah, I mean, I think I wanted to do this podcast to just share with people and maybe make them think about what the nature of being spiritual is. And it kind of feels like this was an extension of my little definition of spiritual wellness, or even just where my mind decided to go when I brought up the topic within the other podcast episode about self-care, not needs. Yeah, it was about self-care. And I was like, spiritual wellness is a component of self-care, right? And I gave a bit of a definition of how it can be these things, but it doesn't necessarily have to look the way that we're used to spirituality looking like. And it can just be about attuning to the experience of human suffering. And I do believe that to be a very good example of how spirituality can look in a world. I'd say it's not connected to spirituality in the same way as it used to be. Like, if you look to Nietzsche, and I really do sometimes, God is dead and we have killed him. Right? And it's really not about there being a literal God that we've killed, or that like the rise and fall of Christianity plays a role, but it's not really about that either. It's like something to do with, I might butcher this a little bit, sorry, but the morality that was imposed, like the moral expectations and standards that we as a society used to adhere to due to Christianity being so popularized and so normalized has to be rethought and has to be redefined. And we can't look to the church as some form of reference point to how to live a quote unquote good or moral life. And in that sense, there's a according to Nietzsche, I would say there's a frightening level of freedom within the ability to choose what morality looks like to one individual. And that invites a lot of room for what I'd say a lack of ethical behavior, a lot of justifying doing a lot of different things, because who fucking knows? Who fucking knows? Who knows? Do we all collectively agree that this is the right or wrong thing to do? Maybe. From a legal standpoint, we do. But it does feel like when we don't have a universally agreed upon moral compass, it's inviting in a lot of subjectiveness, that there could be this slippery slope where that starts to create normals, like new normal, right? Starts to create what's beyond good and evil. It's the new normal. And the new normal can look very frightening. And not necessarily good or bad, but it can look very different from, right, our usual standard of what's right or wrong in the spiritual world. I almost believe that if somebody who was, let's just call them a spiritual authority, maybe 500-600 years ago, were to look at the way spirituality is expressed in our culture nowadays, not even relating to like how many people pray or stuff like that. No, just if they were just kind of had this universal summarization, let's say, they just understood every single heart and mind of every individual, and they kind of just summarized it in some kind of report. They're like, oh, okay, this is just how humans are in relation to spirituality nowadays. Interesting. Would it be better? Would it be worse? Who fucking knows? But I would say there would be I guess it would be different. Fuck, I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is there ought to be some kind of moral standard within these churches or religions, and usually it would pertain to ethics, conducting things in ways that like prevent harm and keep people, you know, let's just say living a good life, a righteous or I suppose conscious life, like a life that takes into consideration the values that are put forth by, you know, most of these religious standards: compassion and equality and generosity in different ways, and just like treating everybody with a degree of respect, like the things that founded these religions at some point along the line a long time ago in history. But then now it's like the versions that exist currently, it's hard to say how much they really uphold those same values. And you know, are we creating an environment where it's not really possible to uphold those same values and have them really stick, and have them really, I guess, proliferate in a way, like continue to go on and impacting the world? Ooh, I've gone down a bit of a rabbit hole here. I feel like this is a challenging tangent for me to really speak to, but I guess it's just I'm trying to consider the relationship religion has, or spirituality has, on human behavior and society as a whole. And maybe it did have more of a role in shaping how people understand certain values when there was a, let's just say, more of a standard or a criteria that people would adhere to. But now it's hard to say what people could even really equate to the typical religious person or the typical person who practiced spirituality. It's almost like there's so much of a variability within those personality traits nowadays. There can be just a lot of different value sets that get imposed within the overarching concept of a spiritual person, and for better or for worse. But I would say there's probably a lack of consistency within, you know, spirituality equating to a person doing things that are actually helping people or supporting people, or at the very least not harming people. I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to say, is like it does feel like there's a lot of people out there that kind of have this role of, we are I am whatever, a spiritual person. There's an identity, there's a belief underneath that being a spiritual person kind of in a sense can justify their actions, but they might actually be hurting people unintentionally or intentionally, as we can see with some extreme cases and wars and stuff. But even those that do it unintentionally can kind of justify their actions through the lens of, well, I'm supporting people, I'm creating some kind of like spiritual, I don't know, community or connection to prayer or spirit, and you know what I do to essentially facilitate that might in itself be wrong, but it's a means to an end. You know, like, I don't know, maybe these kinds of things existed in previous religions as well, and it's just that there was a lack of exposure, or people weren't really aware of those things as much. Maybe there's just more awareness around it, and that's where people kind of lose faith in the, let's just say, the integrity of a spiritual practitioner or a spiritual faith. So maybe that's just it. Like, I've rambled through this a bit, but maybe there's just a lack of integrity within what it means to be a spiritual person nowadays, and how that, in a sense, means that people can have spiritual wellness, but not really want to garner this title, or not want to go out there and become a part of something that might have been more traditionally seen as spiritual. And then the opposite can also be true, that people can be garnering those titles and taking on the prestige and creating the degree of community, but not necessarily upholding deeper integrity, or not upholding certain values that are preventing people from being harmed. Oof. Anywho, spiritual wellness. Did I just like tangent into spiritual illness? Just it's great. The light and the dark, my friends. Spirituality encompasses the light and the dark. So it felt like maybe there was this desire to stem into spirituality in terms of spiritual wellness, and then spiritual illness, and understanding both perspectives of that and exploring that a little bit. So to bring us back to, I would say, one of the main topics on, so not just spiritual wellness, but really talking about what are some practical ways one might be able to, lack of a better word, be spiritual. No, but like, what are some ways that you can cultivate this relationship to this energy one might call spirit? And I would say some of these things are pretty simple to do, right? Just being creative, playing music. Maybe if you can, play music in nature. Painting is one of the ways I feel I can really connect with energies that aren't necessarily human, or aren't necessarily just about the emotional experience I'm going through. Sometimes I feel like I can pull in an energy that's just kind of watching me, or related to me, or kind of something I pray to. And that feels like a beautiful spiritual practice of channeling in some kind of, one might say, external energy. And other ways would be to go to song circles or community events where they allow people to gather and pray in circles, or go, realistically, you could go to church, you could go community events, you could go to any type of community event that fosters people coming together and supporting one another and praying to, you know, whatever energies or deities they pray to. I don't attend these things because I don't really subscribe to an organized religion, but like, damn, is that a beautiful way to connect to your spiritual wellness? And you get, it's not just about praying to this thing and being in favor, or like, you know, you're not just trying to gain favor of this deity or God. It's like, also, you get a lot from just going to an event and singing. Like, it's so healing just to use your voice in general. And then you go into an event where you're meeting with other people. You know, there's a social component to it. There's some emotional support. There's a relatability. There's maybe snacks, right? But then there's also singing with other people and how your hearts get to attune into that space and what the hearts do when they all attune in one space. There's a lot of benefits to going to a spiritual event that isn't just about, I would say, the connection to some kind of higher power. It can just be about the benefits to the body or the benefits to the mind or the benefits to having an open heart and connecting with other humans, which you might not do otherwise. So really telling people that if you like to go and pray, whatever way you pray, that's going to be healing you. That's going to be really, really good for the mind and the body and of course the spirit. So, and that doesn't always have to involve subscribing to a particular religion either. I mean, you could just go to church because you're kind of just curious, not really a huge fan of Christianity or whatever faith it is that they pray with in that church, but you just want to experience that religion and experience the energy. I don't know if you ever walked into one of these like massive cathedrals. When I was in Ecuador, I checked it out. There was this massive cathedral in Cuenca, and I was like, whoa, the art in here is amazing. I love the subtle prayer singing. I don't know what you'd call it, but kind of like almost like throat singing, just, sounds like angels just kind of singing in the back. I was like, those aren't bad. I could dig those vocals. The art in here is amazing. The architecture of this place is incredible. And I just felt the solemn appreciation and reverence of the place, just had this energy to it. And I wasn't going there to pray. I specifically went there just to kind of appreciate the culture and to appreciate the artifact that is this religious space. But I still, felt connected to it in some way. I felt like, there was a way to which it's just a community service and anyone's allowed, right? Anyone's allowed to experience a religious experience. It doesn't need to be, and nor should it be, in my opinion, exclusive. It should be inclusive. Realistically, if there is some degree of exclusiveness, maybe that's one of the things I would say that can bar people to feeling connected to spirituality is there's this exclusiveness, which I'm just going to speak to, especially when it comes to indigenous spirituality. Maybe there was a very good reason it was exclusive. It was protecting these religious practices from being fully eliminated, outlawed at one point. And for survival of these sacred practices that were passed down by word of mouth, it was exclusive. You were only allowed into these circles if you could honor and respect and maintain confidentiality around these particular songs, these particular dances, the way these ceremonies were practiced. It was held in high regard and it needed to be protected. Now, do these things need to be protected still? Maybe. I don't know. That's up to you. But I would say that some of these practices, many of which are communal, don't necessarily need to be protected from being completely wiped off the face of the earth. And we're able to share them openly. And I am so, so, so grateful every time I'm able to attend a sweat lodge or a community run event that teaches me about indigenous philosophy and indigenous traditions. And I'm able to pray to what I'd consider the prevalent deities that are connected to the lands that I'm on, and just have appreciation for the culture and respect for the culture. So, that can look like going to an organized event for sure, but it also can just be going to the land which you consider sacred, which I would say many people, especially if you go to parts of Canada around here, the indigenous land is very sacred. So you go to these forests, you go to these lakes, you go to all the land that hasn't been, essentially gutted by capitalistic ventures, gutted by colonizers, just trying to make a buck, usually. You can go and appreciate and pray to these lands, and you can thank the ancestors, thank the grandmothers, thank the grandfathers, Thank everything that got you to the place where you can sit and be at peace and feel the energy of the land, feel the energy of the water, feel the energy of the wind, feel how it feels in your heart to thank everything and everybody. Thank Creator. Thank Great Spirit. Thank whatever that form of consciousness is in its name, in its title to you. There's many, many names. And just really feeling into the surrender of this bliss that is prayer. It can be singing, and oftentimes is singing. It can just be speaking to the land, speaking to your ancestors, listening deeply to the body. Then, of course, dancing, movement. Oh boy, I love to move, and that's such a healing practice. Prayer through movement, right? Dancing, such a vital component to ceremonies, and the ways people move their body, and the let's just say the trance states that are induced from movement, and listening to drums, and having fires, and sometimes using certain plant medicines, but other times just gathering in community spaces and singing and dancing. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. These are the ways I would say are so simple, so accessible. And there just has to be, I'd say, something of an openness to explore the world of spirituality, to explore what else is out there, aside from what we're used to, what we've been taught, or what our parents did. Just seeing what other options exist, seeing what feels right for us, right? Seeing what really feels like it allows us to access spirit, and not judging, not appropriating is another topic I would like to go into more, but maybe not in this particular conversation. The difference between appreciating a culture and integrating and appropriating in a way that's like monetization. I think that's the main way that one would define appropriation, is where you're monetizing off of the cultural practices of another culture with usually no recognition or acknowledgement for those original practices. And essentially you're deeming them as your own. And even if you're acknowledging the practices and making money off it, that's kind of an ethical gray area too, right? It's like, I suppose there has to be a certain level of respect, and not like these traditions are necessarily gatekeeping every aspect of their spiritual practices, but maybe there are certain, let's just say, songs or pieces of clothing, or there's specific things that ought to remain within those cultures, and then there's other things that really ought to be, it should be shared. I think there's a lot of beautiful pieces of ceremony that are shared and should be shared, and like depending on whom you ask and what indigenous tradition, they would have different perspectives on what ought to be shared and what ought to be kept, in a sense, secret. And I'm sure that changes over time as well. Traditionally, sun dances were, like, that's one of the examples of one of these ceremonies. Sun dances were kept exclusively indigenous, and you were not to invite anyone outside of certain indigenous lineages. And nowadays, I would say there's a lot more inclusiveness. Now, do you take the practices you learn at Sundance and just sort of, create your own little ceremony and monetize it and invite people in and sing those exact same songs and invite everybody to do the same thing? As a non-indigenous person, especially, I don't think so. I feel like that's pretty clearly a way to which you'd be disrespecting those traditions. But I'm curious, as a listener, what's your take on that? What's your thoughts around appropriation? I know I said I wouldn't go into it in too much depth, and I guess this is where I'll end with that, is what are your thoughts? What do you feel? Does just having the awareness that some stuff might be appropriation, does that create this awareness that many people are, by the definition, appropriating other cultures? And is this something that we have control over? Is this something that we ought to refrain from doing, or maybe on some level should hold others accountable when they're doing so? And I personally believe it is something that we should be aware of. And if I notice another person doing it, I will graciously speak to them if I feel they are open to receiving that wisdom, or that acknowledgement, or that accountability. But at the same time, maybe some people just don't care, whether that be the people that are appropriating the cultures, or some indigenous people might just be like, oh, that's actually kind of cool. It's that they appreciate that aspect of our traditions, seeing as though it's not like a headdress, right? That's earned. And it's usually only a chief would wear a headdress, right? And someone's just wearing a headdress and appropriating it. That's pretty clearly a hard line. So I think, like most things, there's probably soft boundaries, things that are not comfortable things to have appropriated, but maybe are less offensive. But then there's other things that are just direct. I suppose they're directly disrespecting the person who goes through the rite of passage and the initiatory steps to earn that title that allows them to wear a certain garment or uphold a certain tradition. So you're in a way not devaluing what that person had to go through and sacrifice to get to that point. It's like you don't just start dressing like a shaman because you think it would be cool and it's a good way to make a buck. Just there's certain things that are kind of clear that we ought not to do. And I feel like we're just in the process of kind of like redefining what those things are. Like, again, look to Nietzsche and God is Dead. We're redefining what it looks like to really, I guess, have a healthy relationship to spirituality and to do what we consider to be the right thing to do. So we're kind of testing the waters, and maybe some of the things that were not okay 100 years ago are actually starting to become okay now. And conversely, maybe some of the things that felt kind of okay then aren't okay now. Or we know now that the perception of it is that that's deeply offensive, and we can do better to just respect those cultures and be open to being humbled and be open to learning about those cultures from the people who have had those traditions, secrets passed down to them, and uphold those traditions and the values of those traditions and those cultures. So, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? Like there's, I would say, many cultural values that are in place for a very good reason and were preserved for a very good reason. So that's my tail end of that conversation. If I guess I go into spiritual wellness and I go into spiritual practices, it makes sense I would talk about appropriation just a little bit. But remember, I really just want to leave you with this. There's so many beautiful ways to connect spirituality. It could be creating art, singing, dancing. It can be gathering with others and singing, or praying in whatever way feels good for you, connecting with nature, using tobacco to do so. It can just be having an intimate moment of ceremony within yourself, creating rituals, which, by the way, ceremony is one thing. Defining everything as ceremony, sometimes we do that. We can say everything is ceremony, which it might be in ways, but I think ceremonial practices are within a container and usually encompass one thing. But rituals, oftentimes we don't consider. Rituals are just things that we do ritualistically. And you can do some really beautiful spiritual rituals, which aren't necessarily ceremonies. And honoring that the ceremonial container is a deeply intentional, I would say transformative place where you can do a lot of deep healing and you can connect to a lot of beautiful energies within a ceremonial container. And maybe you don't always want to. That's just my kind of what if, or my proposition. Maybe you don't always want to create a ceremony around everything. Right? Maybe not everything doesn't need to be a ceremony. It could be ritualistic, it could be intentional, it could be conscious. But what a ceremony encompasses, at least from the traditional lens of most religious practices, or especially indigenous ceremonies, it's a container of connectedness, in particular a connectedness to spirit and a connectedness among people in those communities and their relationship to spirit. And I don't want to misuse that word, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I'm sure there's a lot of different forms of ceremonies. In fact, there are many forms of ceremonies, but I don't want to, at least I'd recommend not misusing the word ceremony when you're maybe referring to something else. Yeah, just for sake of respecting the traditions and, maybe on some level, not inviting in some kind of energetic experience. If you believe you need to be on the guard, which sometimes maybe it's helpful to recognize that you don't want to invite in unwanted energies by just welcoming in. Yeah, but language is very important. So maybe this podcast was a little bit more rambly and I didn't use words that landed for you, or maybe some of these are just my beliefs and I just want to really recognize and acknowledge that. Just exploring this, if some of this doesn't land, that's perfectly fine. Take what lands, leave what does not. If my language does not necessarily define what something is for you, that's also perfectly fine. And I'm open to learning. So thank you for exploring this topic with me. And I hope you join me for future episodes about mental health, spirituality. Going to get a lot more into doing interviews as soon as I can finally organize my time and get people into my space and do some interviews. Hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Talk to you soon. Take care for now. Bye. And just to let you know some of the things that I'm doing in this community. First and foremost, if you're looking for one-on-one counseling, I offer counseling applying parts work as well as art therapy techniques. I'm also going to start creating group containers. Some of these containers will be looking at integrating plant medicine. Other containers will be helping teach people about applying parts work in their own personal life. So if you're interested in any of these offerings, please reach out over Facebook, Instagram, or you can email me at featheroflightcounseling@outlook.com. Thank you.